Hello, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Joseph Aprile, and I would like to read passages from my book entitled America and the Mythology of Greatness. This book was inspired by the fact that I feel that we live in ominous times, and that I believe one of the reasons why this nation seems to be bogged down as it is because we have a series of we hold to a series of myths that do not coincide with reality, and basically this is what my book attempted to treat. So I would like to read excerpts, and I would begin by reading excerpts from the introduction. These times are particularly ominous for a number of reasons. The United States is now the only superpower with a vast stockpile of weapons of mass destruction, the only nation that has ever used nuclear weapons against civilian populations, and currently plans to develop a family of small nuclear weapons designed to be used against hardened targets. The government is also involved in a remarkably expensive military expansion that will further dwarf the military weaponry of even its wealthiest allies. A part of that expansion represents the militarization of space. The world has a lot to be concerned about, especially since the cadre of powerful in the government, the likes of Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Pearl, and Paul Wolfowitz, are urging an unabashedly imperial policy that will threaten all potential foes with deadly and pervasive force. This view has been detailed in a new national security policy that has been promulgated by the George W. Bush administration. I believe this to be a very dangerous document in terms of the kind of precedent it is setting in regard to the basis of foreign policy in the United States. The central theme of this policy is, and I quote, "While the United States will constantly strive to enlist the support of the international community, we will not hesitate to act alone if necessary to exercise our right of self-defense by acting preemptively against such terrorists." End of quote. This worldview stands against major covenants of international law. It will open the door for nations throughout the world to strike out at their enemies based on a perceived threat. It effectively attempts to legitimize the use of overwhelming force against adversaries as a major component of foreign policy. It is the behavior of a powerful rogue state proclaiming itself to be above and outside the community of nations in which it lives, and as such, it is a policy that must be repudiated. I would like to next read part of the introduction which deals with the Patriot Act, an act that was basically forced through Congress after September 11th terrorist attack on the United States. The act was passed hurriedly under significant pressure from Attorney General John Ashcroft, who warned of imminent terrorist attacks if they were not thwarted by the provisions of this legislation. The Congress caved in under this intense pressure and essentially abrogated its obligation to debate such a profoundly important issue, a behavior reminiscent of the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that ushered in the debacle that was the Vietnam War. This act has undermined aspects of the First, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments to the Constitution. The provisions in the Act range from the FBI's enhanced policies of search and surveillance to the indefinite detention of both citizens and non-citizens without formal charges and access to counsel. Furthermore, provisions of this law threaten the right to dissent, a crucially important right in any government that claims itself to be a true democracy. The right to dissent can be effectively compromised by the threat of the possibility of harassment by investigators, by allowing searches on little evidence, and by creating the risk of felony prosecution for minor criminal violations. indicative of just how tenuous our supposed liberties are in the eyes of the law. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia was reported to have made the following comment at John Carroll University, and I quote, "Most of the rights you enjoy go way beyond what the Constitution requires, because the Constitution just set minimums." He went on to say that in wartime, the protections will be ratcheted down to the constitutional minimum. End of quote. In his book entitled All the Laws But One, Civil Liberties in Wartime, the Chief Justice of the United States, William Rehnquist, claimed that and I quote, "the Constitution has not greatly bothered any wartime president." When these sentiments are juxtaposed with the stated belief that the war against terrorism will be fought for many years into the future, the curtailment of civil liberties may in fact become permanent. The following is taken from a piece entitled "The State of Civil Liberties a Year Later" by the Center for Constitutional Rights. And again I quote, "The USA Patriot Act provisions that will chill or even criminalize people's legitimate expressions of their political views. For example, the Act creates a new category of crime, domestic terrorism, which blurs the line between speech and criminal activity. Section 802 of the Act defines domestic terrorism as acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of criminal laws that appear to be intended to influence the policy of government by intimidation or coercion. This definition is so vague that acts of civil disobedience may be construed to violate the law. Civil disobedience typically seeks to influence government policy and therefore may be construed as an attempt to coerce that change. Furthermore, the portion of the definition stating that acts must be dangerous to human life is extremely broad. It does not distinguish between intentional acts and those that cause inadvertent harm. Such a broad definition invites abuse. The American people find themselves at a significant crossroads. If they remain silent, they can only expect to find themselves living in a far more dangerous world than the one in which they are now living. It has already become quite clear that a majority of the citizenry do not accept the idea that the behavior of the United States in the world may have contributed substantially to the events of September 11. They prefer to see themselves as victims of evil powers that envy us our freedom. Most importantly, they seem willing to sacrifice personal liberties in order to feel safer. Americans have become afraid and uncertain, and it is the government that is exploiting this fear. The policies and behavior that the leadership is following will, in fact, make Americans far more vulnerable, especially when they venture far from their own borders. It is only through concerted, persistent effort that the nation can be made to change course and avoid the abyss we are all heading for. If generations to come are to see a meaningful future, we must insist on a change in the way we see ourselves and our place in the world. The veils of myth and self-delusion must be lifted so that we might collectively regain our sanity. Preserving our privileged place in the world through brutal force and the threat of force may succeed in the short term, but is bound to fail over time. The book itself is broken up into chapters that deal with, I feel, are myths that we enshroud ourselves with. And the chapters have titles such as The Myths of Democracy and Freedom, The Myth of Equal Justice, Foreign Policy and the Myth of the World Policeman, Free Enterprise and the Myth of Prosperity, The Global Economy and the Myth of Free Trade, and finally The Myth of Empire. what I outline in this book is well substantiated by documents that can easily be accessed by the public. I would like to read an excerpt from this section on the foreign policy and the myth of the world policeman, especially as it regards or relates to Iraq. And this basically deals with, the war. If we were to follow the money, the meaning of all of this becomes quite clear. Billions of American taxpayer dollars have been used to finance the destruction of Iraq over the last 12 years. Once the Iraqi regime was successfully overthrown and supplanted with the American occupation, private corporate interests such as Halliburton and Bechtel were awarded exclusive contracts for reconstruction and oil development projects and stand to harvest the profits. According to Iraqi law, prior to the occupation, foreign nationals were not permitted to invest in the establishment of or to acquire stock in an Iraqi company. The Iraq Constitution also forbids the privatization of state assets. However, on September 19, 2003, Paul Bremer, the administrator of the Coalition Provisional Authority, or CPA, authorized the implementation of Order Number 39. This order ratified the privatization of 200 Iraqi companies and decreed that foreign firms can acquire 100% ownership of Iraqi banks, mines, and factories. It also permitted these foreign investors to move 100% of their profits out of the country. This wholesale abrogation of Iraqi law is clearly in violation of international law. The Hague regulations state that an occupying force must honor, unless absolutely prevented, the laws in force in the country. It is clear that the process of what is referred to as reconstruction represents the wholesale transfer of ownership of the energy and productive capacity of an entire nation in the hands of essentially American corporate interests. Privatization of Iraqi business is now occurring on a grand scale, with the major benefactors being those who contributed substantially to the George W. Bush presidency. Even the school textbooks are being published in the United States. All this is being done without any measurable input from the Iraqi people. This represents a radical attempt to re-engineer an entire culture into a prototype designed to fulfill American interests and to further feed the voracious appetite of capitalism in its hunger for new markets. In reality, however, it is a strategy that has incurred considerable costs in regard to the suffering endured by the Iraqi people and the American military that functions as a mere pawn in the game of power. The coercive practices of the international economic institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, or WTO, are being met with considerable resistance throughout the world. Iraq represents an entirely new model for economic development, in which a country is first destroyed and then rebuilt from the debris, circumventing completely the cumbersome problems that sovereignty brings. Not only have no weapons of mass destruction been found, but there is no longer talk of their existence. It's as if they were never an issue to begin with. All the accumulated evidence points to the magnitude of the deception that was foisted upon the American people for the purpose of pursuing this course of action. It is certainly behavior worthy of impeachment. At the end of June 2004, the U.S. allegedly handed over sovereignty to the Iraqis. This accounting of what actually transpired is misleading. In fact, Paul Bremer left his position after transferring limited authority to a hand-picked Iraqi leadership. The U.S. has over 140,000 troops and permanent military bases in the country. Furthermore, new Iraqi laws have been crafted by the occupying authority that directly benefit and maintain U.S. political and economic hegemony as previously described. This is the sovereignty of a very dubious kind. I believe that the events that have transpired after this book was completed further validate the comments that I have made so far. Thank you very much for listening. I do hope that this was of interest to you and meaningful as well. Thank you. I would now like to read an excerpt from the section on the global economy and the myth of free trade. Joseph Stiglitz has become a prominent critic of the IMF, World Bank, and the U.S. Treasury. Following a brilliant academic career on the faculties of such renowned institutions as MIT, Yale, and Stanford, he joined the Clinton administration as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. He soon became the Council's chairman and ultimately the chief economist of the World Bank. Over time, he became disillusioned with the institution's neoliberal policies and began to voice his concerns. In 1999, he was fired from this organization. The then U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers was instrumental in dismissing Stiglitz. It must be remembered that the United States Treasury has a 51% ownership in the World Bank and therefore a controlling interest. Stiglitz detailed the role of the IMF in the Russian loan scandal following the demise of the Soviet Union. On October 10, 2001, he won the Nobel Prize in Economic Science. From a paper entitled Development Policies in a World of Globalization, Stiglitz writes, and I quote, "Throughout Latin America today, the question is debated, has globalization failed us or has reform failed? What is clear is that there is disappointment in the policies that have been pushed for the past 2 decades. The policies focusing on liberalization, privatization, and stabilization, which collectively has come to be called the Washington Consensus Policies. The data for the 90s, the first true test of these policies when the countries were freed from the shackles of overhanging debt, helps explain the sense of disillusionment. Growth during that decade was just over half of what it was in the pre-reform and pre-crisis decades of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Even in those countries which have seen significant growth, a disproportionate share of the gains have gone to the better off. The upper 30% or even the upper 10%, with many of the poor actually becoming worse off. Little, if any, progress has been made in reducing inequality, already the highest of any region in the world, and the percentages, let alone numbers, in poverty actually increased." End of quote. During his stay at the World Bank, he witnessed the economic crisis in East Asia in 1997. This will be discussed in more detail later in this chapter. He described this experience in the following way, and I quote, "What I saw radically changed my views of both globalization and development. I have written this book, Globalization and Its Discontents, because while I was at the World Bank, I saw firsthand the devastating effect that globalization can have on developing countries and especially the poor within those countries." According to Stiglitz, when a country gets involved with the IMF, its economy is analyzed and is ultimately presented with a 4-step program that must be adhered to. These steps are the following: privatization, capital market liberalization, market-based pricing, and free trade. They follow a formula that is derived from an ideological perspective rather than from first-hand knowledge of the country that is allegedly being helped. An example of how disastrous such policies can be is that of Ethiopia. The IMF insisted that the Ethiopian government undertake capital market liberalization. It wanted Ethiopia to open up its financial markets to Western competition. Of course, impoverished Ethiopia had no way of competing with the large Western banks. At first, Ethiopia resisted, but inevitably gave in. The results were disastrous, as could have been easily predicted. When global financial institutions entered the country, it resulted in attracting depositors away from the local bank. These large institutions were much more likely to lend to multinational corporations than they were to local small business interests. Interest rates rose, and farmers and small businesses were seriously affected. All these factors converged and ultimately had a devastating impact on the Ethiopian economy. This is but another example of the consequences of IMF policies on the poorer nations of the world. Further examples will help dramatize this point. In this book, in this chapter, I go on to further discuss examples of the effect of global policies. I would like to end by reading from the conclusion. And this is from the final chapter. The country, with its wealth of natural resources, expansive frontiers, and diverse populations, has always been endowed with great potential. The vitality of the American economic engine is indicative of that potential. The possibilities inherent in the American nation are being squandered, however, by both the delusion and arrogance of power. Since the end of World War II, the United States became a world leader, and as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, became the world's only superpower. The power and potency of the alleged American empire is being trumpeted by the government. This particular government is made up of men who represent the needs, aspirations, and ambitions of the wealthy. In their eyes, the world and its people, including the American citizens, are seen as imminently exploitable. They, like many who have preceded them, regard the free and vital political expression of the vast majority of people, many who lead marginal lives, as a threat to their authority. To ensure a stable world, any real movement for a change in the political, social, and economic order must be thwarted. The members of Congress, whose supposed role is to represent the people, have themselves been corrupted by both power and the corporate interest that they have become dependent upon. Although this is not a new scenario, the unabated continuation of the status quo will most likely lead to tragic consequences, especially for the American people, for the following reasons. The dependence upon the force of arms as a legitimate tool for achieving political goals has left the nation with a staggering budget deficit, an expanding national debt, and a continued erosion of the goodwill of vast numbers of people throughout the world who have come to see the United States as exceedingly dangerous. The health and well-being of the American people is further exacerbated by the subservience of government to corporate power, leading to unconscionable tax cuts for the wealthy, a steady deterioration of environmental safeguards, and a contraction of social services for those in need. Working people have paid a huge price for the ascendance of corporate power through the permanent loss of jobs that actually pay a living wage. The significant reduction of the national budget in those areas that encompass social programs has essentially put tens of millions of people at serious risk. A substantial portion of the population, as detailed earlier, already lacks accessibility to health care, adequate nutrition, education, and housing. If these policies continue unabated, the outcome is not hard to imagine. The two-tier economic structure will become more entrenched, leaving larger and larger numbers of people without any hope of improving their plight. The quality of air, water, soil, and oceans will worsen. The deplorable condition of the nation's inner cities will continue to be neglected. More prisons will be built to house the underclass and the disadvantaged. The numbers of people who are homeless or live with hunger or who are one paycheck away from falling into an economic abyss will get larger. Many domestic issues that require immediate attention have been effectively sidelined, ostensibly to focus national energy and resources on the current war against terror. The response of those in power to the singular threat against their authority and economic hegemony throughout the world is to retaliate against the enemy with overwhelming force. In other words, terror is fought with much greater terror. As we have seen in the many examples cited regarding the use of American military power, the underlying motivation for such action is to enforce a kind of stability that ensures American economic domination regardless of the cost in human life. We have seen the implications of the use of such an arrogant and mindless use of power. Many parts of the world have come to view the United States as brutal, unscrupulous, and inherently dangerous. To many, we have become a pariah nation. Many previous empires in the human history have taken the same path, and in each case, it has ultimately led to grief. And finally, I would like to conclude with the following. Real and effective change must proceed from the collective energy of the people. Change will happen incrementally as more and more citizens recognize the nature of the threat and take upon themselves the responsibility to demand and precipitate change. There are in fact many organizations in place that represent the diversity of interest groups that are involved in issues such as poverty, homelessness, healthcare, and the environment. As of yet, these organizations have not had enough of a following to provide the momentum for real change to occur. Individuals need to be awakened to the stark reality that faces them. The machinery of propaganda is effectively used by the private media and the government to delude the public and obfuscate the truth. The myths that are perpetuated to benefit the ruling class appeal to the need to belong and to feel a part of something great. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.